chat. So it is 1 o'clock and we are going to get started. So hello everyone, and thank you all for joining us for Volunteer Canada's webinar, Adapt, Deliver and Learn, Pivoting to a Virtual Volunteer Model. Today with a presentation from the Together Project. A few administrative details before we get underway. If you've not already done so, please ensure your audio is on mute to help us reduce any background noise. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording and the PowerPoint will be shared with all the webinar registrants after the webinar and will be posted on Volunteer Canada's website. We've set aside some time for Q&A at the end of the presentations, but we know that questions and comments will come up as we go. So please use the chat function to put in your questions and your comments, and we hope that you will share and say hello. Let us know who you are joining us today, where you are joining us from. And we'll get to as many of the questions as possible during the Q&A at the end of the presentation. Working and volunteering remotely has or is becoming the norm for many of us across the sector, but making those shifts is not always an easy process. Today we'll be hearing from Anna Hill and Andrew Lusztyk from the Together Project about how they've adapted their program to a virtual model and what they've learned along the way. We hope that their insights can help other organizations going through or thinking about similar transitions to virtual program delivery and virtual volunteering. For those of you who don't know us, Volunteer Canada provides national leadership and expertise in volunteering to enhance the participation, quality, and diversity of volunteer experiences with the goal of building strong and connected communities. We do this in collaboration with a number of stakeholders, including a network of more than 200 local volunteer centers across the country, with nonprofit organizations, with businesses, including Volunteer Canada's Corporate Community Engagement Council, with educational institutions, with government departments, and with volunteers. Since the pandemic hit, there have been a number of surveys looking at the impact on the nonprofit sector, and in early June, Volunteer Canada surveyed organizations about the impact of the pandemic on volunteer engagement. We know, and the surveys have reinforced, that COVID-19 has taken a toll on all nonprofit organizations across the sector. And as we continue into month 6 of COVID-19, the sector is threatened by cumulative effects of decreased revenue, physical distancing, operations pressures. But many of the organizations have managed to adapt during this time, and one of the key transitions that organizations have made is to virtual or remote delivery of programs, services, and volunteer roles. We've seen that many organizations who have made these transitions expect to be keeping them into the future, but it may mean that there are fewer volunteer opportunities as we go forward. When we surveyed organizations, we asked them if there was skills-based or pro bono support that would be required for them, and most indicated that strategic planning was most essential, but almost as many let us know that they either didn't know what they need or more likely weren't quite ready to be able to engage that kind of support in a meaningful way. We expect to see that change over the coming months. Organizations are working hard to keep their volunteers engaged, both those who have not been able to volunteer during this time, but also those who continue to volunteer, new volunteers, those who have been redeployed to new roles, to virtual roles, or those who have taken on entirely new roles. All of this is happening as organizations try to plan for an uncertain future. As I said, we're into month 6, but we know now that we are looking at a much longer trajectory. Organizations are looking at business continuity planning, trying to determine if the changes and adaptations they've made can or will be maintained going forward. We're all planning for a second wave potentially, and we're always looking as we reopen to be able to engage our volunteers safely. One of the transitions that is most frequently referenced is the move to virtual and volunteering roles, which is why we're here today. When we surveyed organizations, we found that not all organizations have programs or services that are able to be adapted, but among those who can, Pre-COVID, about 12% of organizations indicated that they had virtual volunteering roles already. During the pandemic, that jumped to 52% of organizations who had developed new or transitioned existing volunteer roles to virtual delivery. And that same number indicated that they are likely to continue that virtual delivery and those virtual volunteering roles going forward. It's with this in mind that we asked Anna Hill and Andrew Lusztyk, co-directors of the Together project, to share with us today their experiences in adapting their programs to a virtual volunteering model and how they use the code as a frame to frame some of those adaptations. While we're changing screens to Anna and to Andrew, I will welcome and introduce them both to you. Anna Hill is the management lead and co-founder of the Together project, with a focus on communications, innovation, and community programs, including the Welcome Groups for Refugee Claimants pilot program. With her co-director, Anna has helped develop Together Project's emergent response to the pandemic, including a new model of remote social support for refugee newcomers. Andrew is the program's lead and co-founder of Together Project. Prior to moving to Toronto, Andrew spent 6 years designing, implementing, and assessing community development initiatives across 3 continents. Since co-founding Together Project, he's been developing and directing its flagship Welcome Group program, as well as working to measure and improve the initiative's impact. Welcome to Anna and to Andrew, and I'll turn it over to you to share your experiences in moving to a virtual volunteering model.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Deborah, and thank you to the Volunteer Canada team for the opportunity to share what Together Project is learning about online volunteering and remote social support. Let's see. There we go. Next. Sorry, I'm just having trouble moving the slide. There we go. So I'm going to begin with a brief introduction to our Welcome Group program, and then I'll explain how we took what was predominantly an in-person volunteer program and adapted it for online volunteering as part of our pandemic response. I'll then turn it over to my Together Project co-director, Andrew Lusztyk, who will explain how we use the principles of the Canadian Code for Volunteer Involvement to inform our program adaptations. And then Andrew's going to talk about some of the success factors for online volunteering. Together Project is a charitable initiative of the Make Way shared platform, and we're based in Toronto, Canada. Our mission is to connect refugee newcomers and Canadians to build stronger, more integrated communities. We launched the Welcome Group program in 2017 in partnership with a local settlement agency called Costi Immigrant Services. We did this in order to ensure that the program complements but does not duplicate existing settlement services. So the Welcome Group program involves matching a group of 5 or more volunteers with a refugee newcomer household for 6 months of social support. And many of our volunteers are meeting each other for the first time and learning how to work as a team to support a newcomer family. Since 2017, we've matched about 145 newcomer households with over 700 volunteers in 5 cities across the province of Ontario. Early on, we were interested in learning about the highest and best use of community volunteers in building welcoming communities. So we looked at research that identified the characteristics of a welcoming community, and we identified a few things that we thought volunteers could do well, like providing social engagement opportunities and fostering newcomer social capital. And we hope that those would lead to, positive attitudes towards newcomers in community, and also favorable, media coverage of newcomers and volunteers working together. One thing that I think is kind of an interesting side note about this infographic is that it's based on a 2010 Characteristics of Welcoming Communities report. And you can see that digital access is not listed as a criteria, whereas we know that within the pandemic context, digital inclusivity is really important to reach vulnerable populations. And we'll talk about this a little bit more as we continue. In terms of our beneficiaries, we focus our welcome group matches on government-assisted refugees and refugee claimants, also called asylum seekers, because they face greater integration challenges than other types of newcomers. And you can see some of these challenges listed on this slide. But we also see volunteers as our beneficiaries because we spend a lot of time training and supporting and learning from our volunteers to ensure that they're working with newcomers safely and effectively. And this idea of newcomers and volunteers working together to build more inclusive and welcoming communities speaks to the concept of the two-way street of newcomer integration, which has been a sort of important concept throughout our work. In terms of the specific outcomes and activities of our Welcome Group program, we're training our volunteers to work together with newcomers to build social connections to mitigate newcomer isolation. There are different kinds of social connections, but we focus mainly on building social bridges, which means connecting volunteers and newcomers who may have very different backgrounds in terms of language, culture, and lived experience. But over time, we have learned that we can't just ask people with very different backgrounds who speak different languages to all gather in a room and start socializing with one another. Rather, we need to give them a set of common goals and priorities to work towards together. So these common goals are what we call the newcomer-defined integration priorities that form the basis of our matches. And these are things like helping newcomers access employment or language practice opportunities, accessing education, healthcare, as well as just having opportunities to socialize. In terms of our Welcome Group program features, within the context of forming these social bridges, we're still interested in identifying commonalities between newcomers and volunteers in our matches, and these include things like, common professional background, family composition, or we do have some newcomer women heads of household who've requested an all-women welcome group. So we call this particular feature of our welcome group program, we call this preference matching. Another feature that we have is our cultural ambassador program, whereby we match an interpreter who speaks the newcomer's language of origin as a member of the welcome group, and they provide both cultural and language interpretation, either for the first part of the match or throughout the match, depending on the newcomer's language levels. And then lastly, I'd like to call out our use of WhatsApp. So WhatsApp has always been a feature of our matches. We use it to help newcomers and volunteers stay connected on a daily basis. Also, one of our Together Project staff members is in the WhatsApp chat, so we can kind of keep, so we maintain an awareness of the communication that's happening between newcomers and volunteers in case a particular challenge emerges. Prior to the pandemic, the other online aspect of our program delivery was also our volunteer training manual and our extensive list of resources that volunteers refer to help newcomers access the kind of settlement support they need. But other than these online volunteer resources and the use of WhatsApp, the rest of our volunteer interviews, our training, and our matching, it was all happening in person prior to the pandemic. So when the pandemic lockdown began in mid-March, we made a decision to transition to a fully online volunteer program. We made this decision in less than a month. We made a very rapid transition, in part because of our mission, which again is to connect refugee newcomers and Canadians to build stronger, more integrated communities. But we did this because we felt that, that our mission really still applies despite the constraints of the pandemic context. And although we pivoted to online volunteering much faster than we would have liked, and we did not exactly follow a step-by-step process, we did understand that we needed to move through the stages of an innovation cycle in order to make a significant program adaptation. And I just wanted to share this diagram that I found on a Future Skills website, because I think it does a great job of laying out the phases of an innovation cycle, beginning with needs assessment, concept generation, design, and prototyping. In terms of needs assessment, it was very helpful for us to reach out to all of our key constituents. So by all, I mean that we reached out to our newcomers who were in existing matches, we reached out to volunteers who were also in existing matches, and we reached out to volunteers who were about to be matched. We connected with our partners, we reached out to our funders, and also different stakeholders like our academic partners. I just actually want to pause and give a shout out to a few of our key partners and funders here, because without their support, our transition to online volunteering simply would not have been possible. In particular, I just want to mention the TD Ready Commitment, the Toronto Foundation, Ontario Trillium Foundation, McConnell Foundation, Community Foundations Canada, and the Mississauga Community Foundation. And I think, we all recognize that without the support of our funders in this sector, we cannot make a major program adaptation or pivot. I'd also like to thank Toronto City Council and the Toronto Police Services, because there was a really significant potential bottleneck in our program, which had to do with our vulnerable sector screening process. So we were able to reach out to Toronto City Council and then to have a connection at Toronto Police Services, which allowed us to move from like a vulnerable sector process, which required people basically to go against social distancing requirements and go to the bank to get a money order. And instead, we were able to move to an online volunteer vulnerable sector screening process. And this was really critical to allow us to move to online volunteering. And then another thing I want to mention is we did some program analysis to really understand the profile of our volunteers. And one of the things that gave us a lot of confidence in moving forward is that our volunteers, you can see in this graph, they tend to have a lot of experience working with vulnerable populations. 84% of our volunteers had previous experience. And also many of our volunteers have lived experience as newcomers themselves. And these were all things that gave us confidence in kind of piloting a new online virtual volunteering model. So in terms of what we learned from the needs assessment, this led us to generating a concept of what we thought this new volunteer role might look like. You can see here it involves asking volunteers to check in regularly, like weekly at a minimum, with the newcomers they're supporting, socializing with them, helping them navigate virtual services, which were all in flux because the settlement sector was also moving to online delivery. Our volunteers were answering questions, particularly about healthcare and COVID-19, providing language practice opportunities, and sharing really important resources. As part of concept generation, we also had to adapt our volunteer training. So you can see here, we clarified through infographics to our volunteers what the new volunteer orientation and training program would look like. People sign up online to volunteer. They attend a virtual orientation where they talk about, why they're interested in getting involved. Then they attend an online training session. We introduce them to the other volunteers on their team and they connect with them. And then within something like, between 3 and 8 weeks, we find a newcomer household to match the volunteers with. And our match actually, it's occurring over WhatsApp text. And many of the matches will move on from connecting via WhatsApp text to then starting to connect by phone or WhatsApp video. We also had to prototype a number of new volunteer resources to support this transition to online volunteering. We designed a 6-month communication strategy that included specific tactics to explain this new model of online volunteering. So this was things like infographics, kind of impact posts. Also, we developed a COVID-19 resource page. You can see the link here. And we share, weekly, we share different resources that we feel will be beneficial to our volunteers in supporting their matches. And we also created a monthly volunteer newsletter with resources to help volunteers support their matches. And then lastly, we worked with an illustrator to try to kind of create visual images of what this online volunteering model might look like. So we use a number of online platforms and technology to support online volunteering. I've already spoken about WhatsApp. We use Zoom for all of our volunteer training and orientations. Many of our volunteers use Google Meet. MailChimp allows us to send out all of the volunteer newsletters with resources to support the matches. We use SurveyMonkey to both onboard our newcomers, but also to connect with our volunteers and learn about what is working well and not so well in terms of this new model. And then I want to talk about mobile phones and laptops for a minute. So I think, we all know that mobile phones and laptops are critical for nonprofit staff to manage our programs, but we actually cannot onboard newcomers into our program unless they have a mobile phone. And laptops are, many of our newcomers don't have them, but they're becoming more critical, and we find that newcomers who have access to laptops or other kinds of devices tend to have a richer experience. And, Andrew will talk a little bit more about how critical these laptops are for newcomer families where the kids are engaged in online learning in their local school district. So a lot of our volunteers are helping our newcomers figure out how to access these devices. So in terms of, what we can and cannot do in our Welcome Group program delivery online, what we've learned is that every item here that you see on the timeline in blue that was previously delivered in person can in fact be delivered remotely. But just because we've learned that we can move all of these aspects of our program online doesn't mean that we should. So when we think about building back better, we're really trying to stay in contact with our volunteers and newcomers so that we have a good sense of what a future hybrid model might look like. So I just want to kind of end with this concept of, as a social change initiative, it's so important for Together Project to continually learn from our stakeholders throughout an innovation cycle. And, we believe that a concept hypothesis can't possibly be, perfect the first time. And it's up to us to continually improve it. So I'm going to pass it over to my co-director, Andrew, to tell you about how we are evaluating the success of our transition to online volunteering and how we're working to iterate our approach to online volunteering. All right, so I'll just go ahead and transfer the screen share to Andrew.
Okay, hi everyone. First of all, it's a pleasure to join you. Thank you so much to Volunteer Canada for having me and Anna here to talk about our experience. I saw in the chat a little bit that there's really quite a wide representation of individuals from across the country, so I'm really curious to hear about your questions and what your experiences have been like, and hopefully give you some more targeted advice afterwards. So as Anna said, once we'd kind of gone through the concept generation and actually figured out, what are the next steps forward that we immediately need to take, we started to deliver our first iteration, thinking back to that innovation cycle of basically, what we think this is going to look like. This program design, we actually had two perspectives, because the program design was going to be affecting programs that were already underway, as in we already had matches that were made, earlier this year, as well as ones that were about to begin. So we actually kind of had a unique perspective to see, how we can kind of adapt in the middle of a program, as well as how can we immediately learn from that and try some new things with a new program as well. And from the get-go, as Anna said, we kind of incorporated an idea of how we can be evaluating and just tracking the progress of how things are going with those different matches. So in terms of a high-level takeaway around how the program delivery actually panned out, what we realized actually is that the virtual option opened the door to a lot of new volunteers. So previously, as you can imagine, for a program that's very much geared towards building in-person social connections, geographic proximity is a huge factor, especially in a city like Toronto. Whereas all of a sudden, we can now be matching volunteers who are in, an hour drive away from the newcomers that they're going to be working with. All of a sudden, different volunteers actually kind of had more availability to participate in the program. Also, more people were working from home potentially. A lot of people felt as though they didn't really have kind of much to occupy them, obviously, in the after hours, because there's less socializing, et cetera, taking place. So they wanted to give their time to a volunteering opportunity, and this had presented itself. A lot of efficiencies to be found in volunteer intake and training. So, again, due to geographic proximity and other factors, it's a lot easier to deliver a program to a wider variety of people, get kind of more people in the room, so to speak. Obviously, that comes with its own challenges in terms of the efficiency and the effectiveness of those kinds of shifts to online platforms. But certainly, in a pinch, it was actually kind of a smooth shift. And we actually had a bit of a leg up in this transition, because we already had incorporated a number of elements in our program that used elements of remote social support. So, like Anna said, WhatsApp and kind of online remote support had already always been kind of baked into our program. And so in this sense, we had a bit of a head start that kind of helped us basically build on that to incorporate other aspects of remote social support. In terms of challenges, I'm sure you're familiar with these in your own experiences, but services are in flux. So the kind of support that volunteers are offering all of a sudden is a little bit more ambiguous, because it's harder to kind of provide guidance and recommendations when things aren't the way that they're supposed to be. So there's a little bit of a learning curve for our volunteers. Communicating what the new concept is. So again, our bread and butter really was getting a group of people together to come and visit and spend time, FaceTime with different individuals. And all of a sudden we had to kind of explain this idea that we're going to be doing something similar, but a little bit different, because it's going to be online. So it's a bit of a leap of faith of our volunteers, both existing and ones that we're about to begin, to take with us. And also just staff time. I know this is something that many of you are thinking through as well. It took a lot of time and work, both for myself and Anna, our volunteer coordinator, and Tasha, in addition to kind of everything else that we were doing, really developing and implementing this pilot, doing the needs assessment, et cetera. So actually reallocating a lot of our time to do that obviously was a bit of a challenge in and of itself. These next few slides, what I want to do is kind of look at our adaptation through the lens of the Canadian Code for Volunteer Involvement. Again, kind of like with our use of technology prior to the pandemic, we had a bit of a head start here, just because in developing the program, I'd kind of always referred to these different principles as a bit of a roadmap to how to build our volunteer kind of infrastructure, et cetera, effectively. And in the same way that Anna had kind of talked about how the innovation cycle wasn't necessarily, what we'd laid out on a piece of paper before as we started going, I think looking back at the different aspects of adaptation, I think it's useful to look at these different standards, these different principles, and one by one, and kind of see how those adaptations happened on that kind of discrete level. So starting with just volunteer roles and recruitment screening, I think it's what we learned is that you have to be realistic with what aspects of your program actually make sense for virtual adaptation. You clearly won't be able to do absolutely everything the same way. You have to kind of play to your strengths. And unfortunately, it's actually quite hard to imagine what that looks like from the outset. So like Anna said, we had a conception of what it was going to look like when we laid that out. She showed the infographic of kind of what volunteers are going to be doing. In reality, you know, some of those things were true, some of them were less true, and some were unexpected entirely. And you have to be kind of comfortable with having that flexibility. Also, as much as you can, as soon as you have them, providing the volunteers that you're recruiting with real example situations so they actually understand what these new responsibilities are. It doesn't make sense to talk about the program the same way as it was because it's going to be fundamentally different. And this also means that you're not going to be able to necessarily incorporate all of those volunteers that you had previously. Not everyone has the right skill sets for a shift to virtual volunteering. You can imagine things like comfort levels with technology, availability, etc. You do require a slightly different set of skills. We've certainly encountered that with just people who are comfortable and gregarious and sociable online. That might not be the same kind of person who is social and gregarious in person. And so that's a bit of a shift that we've had to kind of overcome over the course of delivering this iteration. And also working with your partners. We like Anna said, we've been benefiting from a wonderful partnership with TD Ready Commitment. They have an online platform for their volunteers, for their employees to volunteer. And part of our recent adaptation with them was basically kind of incorporating what we're doing into that platform. So what you can look at is working with people who we potentially have worked with in the past, corporate or otherwise, community partners, seeing what they're trying to do as well and kind of collaborate to make a program work better for everybody. And so it might mean, again, that you can't always work with the same people or the same organizations that you have in the past, but work with the ones that can kind of fit you into their own existing plans. That's certainly so far been successful for us. In terms of orientation and training, and I mentioned this a little bit, you know, we just right before the pandemic hit, we'd started using a mixer format. So we invited a number of volunteers together to meet one another as well as receive an orientation from us. We've transferred that onto an online platform. Same thing with our volunteer training sessions. We do them virtually, and we've been trying to kind of learn how we can adapt to make them more engaging, more interesting. Obviously, as you know, sitting here in this webinar, you know, our typical training program is typically around 2 hours long, but in those settings, we're incorporating, you know, more of a call and response, more of an interactive format. So how can we shift that into a format online that still delivers, you know, the most critical information about volunteering with us, but in a way that obviously keeps people engaged and they hopefully are retaining what we're training them on. And also, like I said earlier, using relevant stories and examples. So in terms of laying out for volunteers what to expect and also how to adapt and how to kind of address certain challenges that might have not even existed 6 months ago. Try to incorporate that as much as possible into your orientation and training as soon as you have practical examples. And even if you don't yet, if you're just starting to do this, you can probably try to use your imagination around what kind of information will be most relevant in that situation. In terms of risk management and support and supervision, you know, we looked at, you know, things that, again, weren't issues for us 6 months prior. So what risks exist in terms of volunteering virtually? You know, when we talk about in-person interactions, we use typically, because we're working with a vulnerable population, we have a 2-person minimum rule. So 2 people should always be in a room with any vulnerable newcomer that they're working with. We've also requested, you know, kind of transition that online as well. So especially if volunteers, for example, are tutoring children online, et cetera, it's important that there's 2 people on the chat. Things like that that otherwise you might not kind of be thinking about as a risk. Also, in terms of support and supervision, adapting these tools that exist to kind of help make your job easier. So you might have been doing support and supervision differently prior. You might have been doing phone calls, keeping track on, you know, with pencils and paper. But what we're learning about is actually some of the tools that our volunteers are using, we can be using as well. So for example, doing video call check-ins with our matches, and newcomers, and also providing kind of online guides. So on the right-hand side there, you see our language practice guide that rolled out right around the time that we were adapting the program to really kind of fit the needs and preferences of our volunteers. We also did an experience survey where we asked volunteers kind of what they were finding are best practices that worked well for them, what would they be interested in, and moving forward with our next iteration, that's something that we want to incorporate. So for example, Volunteers said that it'd be helpful to have a work plan template, a bit of a kind of a guide around how to use cloud software like Google Docs, shared calendars, etc. And so we want to incorporate that for our future volunteers so that they can kind of hit the ground running with these new tools. In terms of evaluation, so one thing that we did is, outside of the norm, is that we actually had a remote social support experience survey. So we specifically asked volunteers who had transitioned and begun the program entirely remotely what their experience was like, and again, this feeds right back into our next iteration. Luckily, as you can see on the right here, most people have been satisfied with the experience, which is obviously very pleasing to see for us. I'll talk a little bit later about some other feedback that came back from that survey, but more broadly talking about evaluation, we also had 2 research projects underway as this was taking place, so we had to adapt those as well. So shifting interviews from in-person to remote, etc., working with our academic partners to adapt these different research programs to fit this virtual program delivery. And finally, just our regular evaluation. So we still have our own kind of desired outcomes, our own desired impact, and so as much as we can, try to continue to track those impacts, obviously with the caveat of the fact that we're doing so under a pandemic, so factoring that into what results you might be getting from those surveys. Finally, recognition, which is super important for volunteers too. So we've continued an interview series that we do called Together Hello, where we interview individual volunteers about their experiences, about what they've learned. So we've certainly been doing that through the course of the pandemic. So we've been kind of featuring some of our stellar volunteers online. We also, in the middle of the pandemic, started a podcast, so another way to engage our audience. So kind of a 15-minute chat with some of our volunteers about their experiences to try to create a different kind of platform, maybe more engaging format. Also working together with corporate communication platforms. So for example, we're working together with TD to kind of help broadcast our message about the successes of their volunteers, how they've adapted to the pandemic to their audiences, and that's obviously useful information for us. And also because their collaboration is going to be continuing, we can translate that into future recruitment potential. Also through social media and our volunteer newsletters, in addition to the kind of regular communication that we'd be doing through this, as Anna mentioned, we created a communication strategy that incorporated both of these aspects of our work so that we can kind of directly speak to our audience both externally and internally, and also tailor our content to the pandemic situation. I thought it'd be helpful too, just to kind of give you a snapshot of what this actually looks like, because I know Anna did a fantastic job of covering what the program is, but in case you're curious, a more hands-on approach of what actually takes place. These are 4 sample matches. So these are matches between welcome groups and newcomers, and the different kind of challenges that they've faced and how they've addressed these different priorities in a remote virtual volunteering setting. The first is a large family. This is a large Syrian family. This actually, the article in the Toronto Star featured them at the early days of the pandemic. They're there in the middle. I urge you to go have a read of that article. It's a fantastic story. And their challenges are pretty widespread. I mean, there's significant health challenges in the family that the volunteers are helping them navigate, especially in the changing context of the pandemic. Working through education, with classes being canceled, volunteers shifted to an online platform to help with language practice and just with schoolwork and other recreational activities for the children. Regular language practice for the adults who still wanted to learn. As you can see in the title of the article, the parents were still very keen to continue with language practice despite the fact that their ESL classes had been canceled at that time. And seeking employment. So at the same time, the eldest son in the family still really wanted to work, so the family had been helping him with job readiness, helping him with interview skills and building his resume. We also had an individual, so this was a single woman from Eritrea who spoke fairly good English, but she really wanted to focus on language practice. So they've been very successful, her and her group, at doing regular Zoom calls where they incorporate an element of socializing as well, because they luckily had a chance to bond in person. And so they've kind of shifted to filling each other in on what they've been up to and using that as an opportunity to practice language. And also helping her learn about services and how they've been changing. So employment agencies, et cetera, working as advocates in her situation there. In another case, we had a young couple, LGBTQ+ from Barbados, it's 2 young women, who wanted to further their education. So the volunteers have been helping them navigate their different education options. Also socializing. This match has been fantastic in terms of providing some innovation for us in terms of the potential of remote social support. They do online cooking classes together, over Zoom. The couple intends on getting married, so that they've been doing wedding planning sessions together with the volunteers. So it's been a really kind of a nice picture of how this could successfully work in a social setting as well. And also with employment, so helping them find work to kind of supplement their income as well during that time. And finally, there's a single parent, a refugee claimant mother, who is an example of someone who's come here with strong English skills, so language practice isn't necessarily a priority, with a really strong background in finance, and who here is, especially now, is really looking for how to transition those skills and that background into a good job, a meaningful employment here in Toronto. So the volunteers have been helping her through that as well. So that's a bit of a snapshot of who we've been working with and the kind of work that our volunteers have been doing remotely. Just quickly moving to some of the feedback that we got through those surveys, as I mentioned earlier. In terms of the advantages that we've been reported back from our volunteers, a lot of them, like I said, really appreciate the flexibility in terms of scheduling availability. You no longer have to factor in, an hour and a half commute or traffic, et cetera, to engage with the family. Also the streamlined onboarding and training. So I think that for a lot of people, they felt better engaged. They can be more included in the broader community. Also the fact that they had an opportunity to kind of use some of these online tools that otherwise they might not have felt necessary to the experience, but they're actually kind of learning and becoming more effective in the process. And also what we'd heard from some of our newcomers is that actually they enjoyed the experience of initiating the connection remotely. So in terms of their own comfort levels, they actually preferred to meet with their volunteer welcome group via WhatsApp or via Zoom before kind of getting closer to them in person. So that's also a surprise preference that we learned about as well. In terms of the limits, which is also, I think, important to bear in mind, for a lot of our volunteers, especially the newcomers, video calls can be really overwhelming or difficult to understand due to the next point, technological or internet challenges. It's obviously not the same. The fact that it's easier doesn't necessarily mean it's a better way to connect. This certainly shouldn't be considered a replacement for in-person contact. And for some of our volunteers, it has been a bit of a challenge to kind of feel engaged in that way. Also, just technological and internet challenges, poor internet connections, lack of access to devices have been certainly challenges for our newcomers. For volunteers, in terms of their own work together with the rest of their welcome group, as you can imagine, it's harder to kind of build that sense of camaraderie, to feel unified in your purpose without that face-to-face interaction. When the Zoom call's over, you kind of, you go back into the void and you don't know what's going on with the other volunteers. You haven't had a chance to kind of meet in person, and that's been a bit of a challenge for some of our volunteers as well. Also, there's been a more limited range of support activities involved. So traditionally, there are a lot of different priorities that our families face, the families in our program face, and there's only so much that you can do remotely, and certainly there's barriers around, one of which is language, that are more insurmountable for other volunteers. So for example, newcomers with very low language levels who exclusively have to rely on an interpreter, you can imagine how that creates, that barrier is that much higher when you're dealing with remote social support. So if you're on a video call with an interpreter, with your volunteers, and somebody who has a low language level, the effectiveness of, for example, language practice or even navigating most challenges is that much higher. So there's just a kind of more limited range, which we've turned into an opportunity to kind of refocus on the aspects of the work that really do find effectiveness. Finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't, mention the realistic aspect of the fact that the pandemic itself did have a very negative effect on the matches that were already underway when the program, the program that was already underway when the pandemic hit was negatively affected. And there's a number of reasons for that, as you can probably imagine. Some of you probably already experienced this with your volunteers. The priorities changed. There's new goalposts in terms of what success looks like and what regular interaction looks like. Routines have been broken, so a lot of there's a lot of heartbreaking cases where there's a lot of really wonderful regular in-person interaction that was set up in a match that obviously can no longer take place. The technological challenges were there. Priorities of the volunteers as well. I mean, as you're familiar, a lot of people had lost their jobs. They had to take care of their families. They were unable to kind of fully focus on the volunteer experience, which obviously had a negative effect on their experience overall and on their match. And also just general frustration. A lot of people, have pandemic fatigue. A lot of people are frustrated with the slow pace of services, the ever-changing nature of the services that they're typically offered. And so all of that, I think, had a bit of a negative effect on the matches that were underway as well. I'll just quickly run through some of these success factors, and just with a caveat that, this is geared towards really working with a vulnerable population, but I think there's a lot to take away here for any kind of volunteer program that you're thinking about running. One is a kind of an obvious one. Make sure that the volunteers that you plan on working with or that you're recruiting are not just have access to technology, but are actually comfortable with technology, which I think is a kind of a critical distinction. Again, it's one thing to be able to hop on a Zoom call. Are you able to be effective on a Zoom call? And I think you should be very honest with the volunteers that you're thinking about engaging with in your program about that aspect of the work. Low language barrier, again, this doesn't mean don't work with newcomers or other vulnerable populations that have low English levels, but just be conscious of the fact that the barrier between them and the volunteers that you want to engage should be low. So for example, we've shifted and focused a lot of for example, let's say Arabic speaking volunteers to form groups specifically to work with newcomers who have low English skills but speak Arabic. So that way you're kind of reallocating your volunteer resources to try to lower that barrier as much as possible. Make sure that there's a shared commitment to the program. Even if you're not working with newcomers, certainly with the volunteers, make sure that they kind of understand exactly the contours of what you're trying to do, what success can look like. And if you are working with a beneficiary community like vulnerable newcomers, you might want to consider having adding a step maybe to your intake process to make sure that they understand what this program looks like, what it doesn't look like, so that when you're in the middle of a match or in the middle of the program delivery, no one's confused as to why there's how the program is different or how their expectations weren't met. Making sure that your volunteers are available and reliable. I think that one of the challenges with remote access is the fact that it's very easy. It's very easy to sign up. You hit a button, you send an email. It's a lot easier than, for example, hopping in your car and showing up somewhere to volunteer. But what that also means is that it's also easy for them to not be available, to maybe put this volunteer experience in the kind of the back seat of what's going on in their lives. And so you want to make sure that when your volunteers are being signing up, that they understand what their responsibilities are, how important it is to be available, and especially if you're working with a vulnerable population, the importance of reliability, certainly for any program, but in this case, especially if you want to build trust between two different communities, you really need to show that you're reliable. And that's extra difficult when you're doing so remotely. This is also really important, I think, both for you as people who are presumably engaged with volunteer programs, but also for your volunteers, is really setting reasonable expectations and also being patient around the nature of this work, where you have to have a good degree of flexibility around the fact that things might not work as you expect. They certainly won't work the same way as you have been doing them in the past, and you have to be realistic for yourselves around what that is. Like Anna said, taking kind of like a learning approach to this entire process, as opposed to this is what the program is going to look like, we're just going to map it onto an online platform. Give yourself some time, if possible, to do these kind of concept generation and iteration process to really land and find out where you actually want your volunteer program to exist. Same way when you're talking to your volunteers, make sure that they have a reasonable expectations as to what the volunteer experience looks like, what goals look like in the context of remote social support or virtual volunteering, just so that there's no unmet expectations through the course of your program delivery. And finally, when you're supervising or working with volunteers, it's good to have that kind of clear guidance as to what they're going to be doing, but you might be surprised pleasantly, and maybe negatively, but hopefully pleasantly, about what they come back with, what they innovate themselves. So we're very lucky. We have this huge cadre of volunteers who are also kind of our eyes and ears, and a host of innovation comes out of how they adapt to these different challenges. We're by no means experts in all these different virtual platforms. We're learning about what it can look like and hopefully taking some of those practices and using that in the next iteration for other volunteers. So learn from your volunteers, be flexible with how they reach the different goals that you're setting for them, but make sure that you kind of give them a good place to start in terms of some kind of a work plan to work through. Finally, just to wrap up, what's next for Together Project and kind of what we're up to. Like I said over the course of my presentation, we're constantly incorporating what we're learning into the next iteration. So, what do we want to keep? What do we want to tone down? How can we potentially grow this? And built in the spirit of building back better, 1 year from now, what is the program going to look like if things are back to normal? How much do we take away from the virtual volunteering experience and how much room is there in that for our regular program delivery. And finally, doing what we're doing now, so sharing our findings more broadly. Obviously, this is kind of a wider net, but even working just with our partners, helping them adapt as well, and also learning from them to kind of how we can collaborate, how we can make this work ultimately for the different beneficiaries of our program. So thank you very much. I'll wrap it up there. Yeah, I think Anna and I are looking forward to any questions you might have. Thanks again.
Great, that's terrific. Thank you both, Anna and Andrew, very much for all of this. This is a lot of information that you shared, so much detail about the work that you put in and the learnings that you've had along your journey. One of the biggest things that I took away from that was one of the last things you said about taking a learning approach, which I think we're all doing as we navigate this evolving and ever-changing time. So I think that's good advice for everybody. Andrew, I'm going to get you to just stop sharing your screen for a minute. That's great. We did hear a lot of information today, and Andrew summed it up in his last slide quite well. I think it seems in the chat that a lot of you are thinking about and working on these kinds of transitions, and I think the advice and the learnings from the Together project are worth taking away in the context of your own organization, starting with being realistic. We're all trying to do our best, and the advice to be realistic in your needs assessment of your programs and your organization's programs and volunteering roles that can be transitioned, and setting realistic expectations about what is possible. We heard a lot about the impact of technology, not just the access and the ease of technology, but in some cases even access to internet and high-speed internet. Communicate, 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 I think is good advice no matter what we're doing, but especially in a pandemic and when we are in a learning environment of trying something new, to communicate with all of our stakeholders about how we're doing and how it's going, to be able to get that feedback. I really like the idea of sharing real examples and stories as we move into new experiences and new ways of doing things. Having some real example of what this could look like will likely help volunteers, clients, and staff as well, as to feel more comfortable with the work that they're going to be doing going forward, and providing clear guidance but remaining flexible. So we want to make sure that volunteers, clients, and staff know what the expectations are, but we understand we're in a changing environment and that those things are changing all of the time. So thanks again. We are going to take a look at some of the questions, and we have a few in the chat. So early on you were talking about working with different partners and stakeholders to get this up and going, and one of those was Toronto Police Services. And I wondered, the question in the chat was if you could go over the virtual vulnerable sector screening process with Toronto Police Services that you went through.
Sure, Andrew, maybe I'll respond to this one. So we were provided with a contact at Toronto Police Services who suggested that as an interim solution, we simply mail in a list of volunteers at, every 3 weeks to 4 weeks, and then Toronto Police Services does kind of online, they have their own internal online process where they do their vulnerable sector screening, and then they just mail out an approval letter stating that the clearance has been confirmed. And this is quite different than what we used to do. We were asking all of our volunteers to send us a money order or certified check, which would require them to go to a bank or a post office to get that. And obviously during the pandemic, that was not a realistic request or even a safe request of our volunteers. So as far as what Toronto Police Services will be doing moving forward, I think we would have to reach out to them to find out what their plans are. But again, their responsiveness in taking this online approach and just doing these name checks for us and mailing out the clearance has really allowed us to move forward. and make these matches. And this year we've probably already matched, I would say, well over 150, we're probably closer to 175 volunteers who've gone through this online clearance process.
Well, it's great to hear that you had that experience with Toronto Police Services. I know that the experience, it depends on your local police services, what capacity and what screenings they were offering. And we know early on there was great difficulty in getting the required checks for volunteers. We know that over time that's improving. We hope that that's improving more. And in addition to police services, organizations were turning to some of the private companies to be able to do their screenings as well. Mm-hmm. So good that there were options, and good that your experience with Toronto Police Services worked out well. And I guess the lesson there is to be able to contact and reach out to police services to see what is possible.
Yeah.
Another question that we have from the chat was about wondering what specific support or commitments or understanding from volunteers did you appreciate the most to help you to do this pivot to the remote engagement setup?
I can take a stab at that. I mean, to be honest, it sounds like a cop-out answer, but I think the flexibility, has been such a huge boon for us. You know, like everybody else, our volunteers were certainly caught off guard by the changing circumstances of what took place. But I think, you know, when we explained the continued need and the both in terms of the need of newcomers, but also our need to kind of continue through a different lens, it's a great credit, I think, to our volunteers that most are willing to give it a shot. Certainly, like you saw in our experience survey, it didn't necessarily always work out the way that we'd intended, but the fact that they were willing to try, I think, has been super helpful. And currently, I think what we're seeing a lot of, which is super positive, is a lot of great feedback. I think it's almost as though, you know, doing virtual volunteering gives people a little bit more flexibility to try things differently. I think it's almost as though, in the traditional sense, what we were doing with in-person visits had a little bit more structure to it. It had a little bit more rigor in terms of what the kind of contours of the program might look like. Whereas I think with the virtual experience, usually positively, sometimes obviously negatively, but usually positively, we've seen a lot of innovation coming from our volunteers. And I think that, like I said, we can't kind of figure this all out on our own. So having looking at your volunteers as really, you know, assistance in your process of learning about the program, I think has been really beneficial to us. And certainly from the kind of tools that they use and seem to be popular, to the kind of, you know, the kind of rhythm that they find to their matches, that's all useful for us, because it means that both provides those examples for future volunteers, but also we're learning about what works and what doesn't, and ultimately hoping that we can drive that back into the impact that we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, and I think that just reinforces the whole idea of your earlier point about taking a learning approach, keeping the lines of communication open, that reciprocal relationship and collaboration that helps any successful program move forward. Just a reminder from one of our attendees that, you know, virtual volunteering is not always, it takes on many forms, and sometimes it's virtual in the sense of you're doing something remotely to help. And we had one attendee who mentioned that they had asked their employees to join a knitting group to make baby blankets for infants and toddlers for their sponsored program with the YMCA. So sometimes it's connecting using a virtual means, and sometimes it is doing something remotely to be able to support an organization. So a reminder that there are different ways of volunteering virtually, let's say. Not volunteering virtually, virtual volunteering rules. I keep getting, when I say that, people remind me it's the volunteers are real, it's the volunteering that is done virtually. So terrific. So we're almost at 2 o'clock, and I'm conscious of time. So I thank you both again for your time. Remind our attendees that today's presentation and recording will be posted on Volunteer Canada's website under the COVID-19 resources page. You'll find there a list of upcoming webinars, webinar recordings, and all kinds of other useful resources related to advocacy, governance, and volunteer management during this time. Watch for our upcoming webinars. The next one will deal with insurance, health and safety issues as we look to re-engage volunteers safely to in-person volunteering rules. If you have any questions for either Anna or Andrew, they've provided their email addresses, so you feel free to get in touch with them directly or with Volunteer Canada as you like. Again, thank you all very much for joining us today. We appreciate your time and attention in a very busy time, and we hope that we will see you again for our next webinar. Thanks again to Andrew and Anna, and thanks everyone. Enjoy your day.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks everyone.